The sound that woke William Thompson wasn't the familiar call of any creature he'd known in 68 years of life. It was the desperate plea of a mother about to watch her children become orphans. Bill's weathered hand froze on his coffee mug, steam rising in the dawn light as something primal in that cry cut through 3 years of numbness since Margaret's death. It wasn't just any animal in distress. It was terror-given voice. His cabin door slammed against the wall as he stumbled outside, bare feet hitting frost-covered ground. The sound came again, closer now, more urgent, and Bill's blood turned to ice as he recognized the location. Margaret's old sanctuary clearing, where she'd secretly nursed wounded creatures back to life, where he'd made her release that wolf pup 8 years ago, where she'd cried for hours afterward, whispering, "You don't understand what you've taken from me, Bill." "Sweet Jesus," he whispered, grabbing his walking stick with trembling hands. What was waiting for him in those woods? And why did it sound like Margaret calling his name? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. William Bill Thompson had been many things in his 68 years. A devoted husband, a patient elementary school teacher, a man who believed in the goodness of small gestures and the power of quiet consistency. But as he stood in his empty kitchen that October morning staring at the 2 coffee cups he still automatically set out each day, he was simply a man drowning in the silence left behind by the dead. The cabin on 47 acres in the Adirondack Mountains had been Margaret's dream, inherited from her father along with his fierce love of wild things. For 43 years of marriage, Bill had watched his wife transform their property into an unofficial sanctuary for injured wildlife. She'd always said the land chose its caretakers, not the other way around. Now, 3 years after her sudden death from what the doctors called a massive stroke, Bill wasn't sure who was taking care of whom. His arthritic hands shook slightly as he reached for Margaret's photograph on the kitchen windowsill. In it she was laughing, her silver hair catching sunlight as she held a young fox kit against her chest. That photo had been taken just months before she died, yet she looked so alive, so purposeful. It was a look Bill hadn't seen in his own mirror for a very long time. "Morning, Maggie," he whispered to the photograph, a ritual that had become as essential as breathing. "Another day in paradise, right? Though I'm starting to think paradise is just a fancy word for loneliness." The phone on the wall, an old rotary model Margaret had insisted on keeping, remained stubbornly silent. His son Jake had called exactly twice since the funeral, both times with thinly veiled suggestions about selling the property and moving to a more practical living situation in Albany. The local grocery store delivered supplies once a week, and doctor. Peterson in town kept pressing him about those senior moments that were becoming more frequent. Forgotten appointments, misplaced keys, conversations with people who weren't there. But Margaret was there, wasn't she? In the way morning light still struck her favorite chair by the window. In the bird feeders he maintained religiously because she'd loved watching cardinals in the snow. In the careful way he avoided the back bedroom where he'd found her that terrible morning, peaceful as if she'd simply decided to stop fighting whatever sadness had been consuming her. Bill's pension from 4 decades of teaching barely covered the rising property taxes, and his savings were dwindling faster than autumn leaves. Jake kept mentioning numbers, what the land was worth, what assisted living facilities cost, what responsible adult children did when their parents became unsafe. The words felt like stones thrown at glass, each conversation leaving another crack in what remained of Bill's independence. Yet something kept him anchored to this place, where Margaret had been happiest. Maybe it was stubbornness, or maybe it was hope that purpose would find him again among these ancient trees and forgotten trails. He'd been a teacher long enough to recognize the difference between giving up and simply waiting for the next lesson to begin. That lesson, as it turned out, was already calling to him from the woods. Bill's bare feet found their footing on the familiar trail that wound through towering pines toward Margaret's old sanctuary clearing. The October air bit at his exposed skin, but adrenaline kept him moving forward, guided by that haunting cry that seemed to pull at something deep in his chest. 40 years of teaching had taught him to recognize distress in any form, and whatever was making that sound was running out of time. The path opened into a small meadow where Margaret had once built feeding stations and shelter boxes for wounded animals. Sunlight filtered through the canopy, casting dancing shadows across the frost-covered grass. But it was the scene in the center of the clearing that stopped Bill's heart cold. A massive Burmese python, easily 12 feet long and thick as a telephone pole, had coiled itself around a gray wolf. The snake's muscular body contracted rhythmically, each squeeze forcing desperate whimpers from the trapped animal. But this wasn't just any wolf. She was clearly a nursing mother, her swollen teats indicating cubs somewhere nearby who depended on her for survival. The wolf's amber eyes met Bill's across the clearing, and in that moment, he saw something that shattered every rational thought in his head. It was the same desperate, pleading expression he'd seen in Margaret's eyes during those final weeks when she'd grown so quiet, so distant, as if she were already slipping away from him. "Jesus Christ," Bill breathed, his walking stick trembling in his grip. The python was an invasive species, probably an escaped or released pet that had somehow survived in the northeastern wilderness. He'd read about them in Florida, how they were decimating native wildlife populations. But here in upstate New York, it was almost impossible, yet the evidence was crushing the life out of a wild creature right in front of him. The wolf's breathing grew more labored with each passing second. Her struggles were weakening, but her eyes never left Bill's face. There was intelligence there, a desperate communication that transcended species. She was asking for help, and they both knew he was her only chance. Every sensible instinct screamed at Bill to back away, to call animal control, to let nature take its violent course. He was 68 years old with arthritis and a weak heart. One wrong move and that python could easily add him to its list of victims. But as the wolf's whimpers grew fainter, Bill heard Margaret's voice in his memory. "Sometimes the most important thing you can do is show up when something needs you, even if you're scared." Without allowing himself another moment to think, Bill charged forward, raising his walking stick above his head. "Get off her!" he shouted, bringing the wooden cane down hard on the python's massive head. The snake hissed and loosened its grip slightly, confused by this unexpected attack. Bill struck again, this time with a heavy stone he'd grabbed from the ground. The python's head snapped toward him, its mouth opening to reveal curved fangs, but Bill was beyond caring about his own safety. All he could see was the wolf's fading strength, her desperate need to return to cubs who would die without her. "Come on, you bastard!" Bill yelled, his voice cracking with effort and fear. He grabbed the wolf by her scruff, pulling with strength he didn't know he still possessed. The python's grip loosened further, and suddenly the wolf was free, gasping and shaking, but alive. As Bill pulled her clear, the wolf's claws raked across his forearm, leaving deep gashes that immediately began bleeding. The pain was sharp and immediate, but he barely noticed. The wolf collapsed beside him, sides heaving as she fought to catch her breath, while the python slithered away into the underbrush, apparently deciding this particular meal wasn't worth the fight. For several minutes, man and wolf lay side by side in the clearing, both struggling to process what had just happened. Bill pressed his torn flannel shirt against his wounded arm, watching as the wolf slowly regained her strength. He expected her to flee immediately. Wild animals didn't linger around humans, especially after traumatic encounters. Instead, the wolf lifted her head and looked directly into Bill's eyes. What he saw there wasn't fear or aggression, but something that made his throat tighten with unexpected emotion. It was gratitude, pure and unmistakable, from one survivor to another. "You're welcome, girl," Bill whispered, his voice hoarse from shouting, "though I'm not sure who saved who here." The wolf struggled to her feet, favoring her left hind leg where the python had compressed too tightly. She took a few tentative steps toward the tree line, then stopped and looked back at Bill. For a moment that seemed to stretch beyond time, they regarded each other across the small distance between wild and tame, predator and protector. Then she was gone, melting into the forest with surprising grace despite her injuries. Bill sat alone in Margaret's sanctuary, bleeding and shaking, wondering if he'd just experienced something miraculous or simply lost what remained of his rational mind. 3 days passed before Bill saw her again. He'd spent those days tending to his wounded arm with antiseptic and bandages, telling himself he'd imagined the intelligence in those amber eyes. Wild animals didn't show gratitude. They survived and moved on. That was the natural order Margaret had tried to teach him during all those years of watching her care for injured creatures. But on the 4th morning, as Bill sat on his back porch with his coffee and Margaret's photograph, movement at the edge of the tree line caught his attention. The gray wolf emerged slowly from the shadows, something dangling from her mouth. She moved with obvious pain, favoring that injured leg, but her posture was deliberate, purposeful. Bill's breath caught in his throat as she approached to within 20 feet of the porch, close enough for him to see what she carried. It was a leather collar, old and weathered, with a metal name tag that caught the morning sunlight. Gently, almost ceremoniously, she placed it on the ground between them and backed away, her eyes never leaving his face. With trembling hands, Bill descended the porch steps and picked up the collar. The leather was soft with age, the metal tag tarnished green around the edges. But the name engraved there made his knees buckle. Sierra, in Margaret's careful handwriting, with their old phone number beneath. "Sierra," he whispered, and the wolf's ears perked forward at the sound of her name. "Sweet Jesus. You're Margaret's Sierra." The memories came flooding back like a dam bursting. 8 years ago, Margaret had found an injured wolf pup caught in an illegal snare on the far edge of their property. The pup's leg had been mangled, her spirit nearly broken by days of terror and pain. Margaret had nursed her back to health in secret, keeping her in the old barn, feeding her by hand, talking to her for hours in that gentle voice she used with all wounded things. Bill had discovered them 3 months later and demanded Margaret release the wolf immediately. "It's not a pet, Maggie," he'd insisted, his voice sharp with worry and practicality. "She's a wild animal. She could turn on you, hurt you. And if the state finds out we're harboring a wolf, we could lose everything." Margaret had argued, tears streaming down her face. "She trusts me, Bill. She needs me. I can see it in her eyes. She's not ready to be alone yet." But Bill had been firm, driven by fear he'd never fully acknowledged. Fear of losing control, of Margaret's soft heart leading them into legal trouble, of admitting that his wife understood something about healing that he didn't. He'd contacted the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center downstate, and within a week, Sierra was gone. Margaret had cried for days. She'd stopped talking about the animals she was treating, stopped sharing the small victories and heartbreaks that had once filled their dinner conversations. Something vital had dimmed in her after Sierra's departure, though Bill had been too blind to see it at the time. Now, staring at the collar in his hands while Sierra watched him with those knowing amber eyes, Bill felt the full weight of what he'd taken from both of them. Margaret had lost her most meaningful connection to the wild world she loved, and Sierra had lost the human who'd shown her that not all people were enemies. "You remember her," Bill said, his voice thick with emotion. "After all these years, You came back looking for her." Sierra took a step closer, close enough that Bill could see the scars on her leg where the old snare had cut deep. She was magnificent now, fully grown and powerful, but there was something almost gentle in the way she held herself around him. She remembered Margaret's touch, Margaret's voice, Margaret's love. "She's gone, girl," Bill whispered, holding up the collar. "She died 3 years ago." "Stroke," the doctor said, "but I think it was something else. I think her heart just gave up trying to heal things I kept breaking." As if she understood, Sierra's head dropped slightly, and she let out a soft whine that sounded remarkably like grief. For several minutes they stood together in shared sorrow, an old man and a wild wolf, both mourning the woman who had loved them without condition. Then Sierra did something that made Bill's heart stop entirely. She approached him slowly, deliberately, until she was close enough to touch. Gently, carefully, she pressed her nose against the bandage on his wounded arm and looked up into his eyes. The message was clear. She remembered his scent from the python attack. She knew he was the one who had saved her. "You're thanking me," Bill breathed in amazement. "You came back to thank me and to— what? To tell me you remember her too?" Sierra backed away a few steps, then looked toward the tree line and let out a soft bark. 4 small shapes emerged from the shadows, wolf cubs, probably 10 weeks old, their fur still fluffy with youth. They tumbled over each other in their eagerness to follow their mother, yipping and playing as cubs do. Bill's eyes filled with tears as he understood. Sierra hadn't just come back to remember Margaret. She'd come to show him her family, to share with him the most precious things in her world. Just as Margaret might have done if she'd lived to see these new lives, these small miracles of survival and hope. "She would have loved them," Bill said, his voice breaking. "She would have sat out here for hours just watching them play, telling me about their personalities and their little habits." Sierra looked at him for a long moment, then made a decision that would change both their lives forever. She called softly to her cubs, and they bounded toward the porch, curious and fearless in the way of young things who trust their mother's judgment completely. For the first time since Margaret's death, Bill felt something stir in his chest that might have been joy, purpose, the sense that maybe, just maybe, he hadn't been forgotten by the world after all. What began as a chance encounter became a daily ritual that breathed life back into Bill's empty routine. Each morning, as the sun crested the pine tops, Sierra would emerge from the forest with her 4 cubs in tow. They'd established an unspoken boundary. The cubs could play in the clearing near his cabin, but never ventured onto the porch itself. Sierra remained watchful but relaxed, positioning herself where she could see both her young and the surrounding forest. Bill found himself setting his alarm earlier each day, eager to witness their arrival. He'd sit on his porch steps with his coffee, talking to them as he once had to his 3rd-grade students. "Morning, class," he'd say, and Sierra's ears would perk forward as if she understood the gentle humor in his voice. "Today's lesson is about trust, I suppose. Something your mama and I are both still learning." The cubs had distinct personalities that reminded Bill why he'd loved teaching. The largest, a male with a distinctive white patch on his chest, was clearly the leader, first to investigate new sounds, first to challenge his siblings to rougher play. Bill nicknamed him Principal. The smallest female stayed close to Sierra's side, nervous but observant, reminding him of the shy students who absorbed everything from the back of the classroom. He called her Scholar. The other 2 were twins in behavior, if not appearance, mischievous, fearless, constantly tumbling over each other in elaborate wrestling matches that made Bill laugh out loud. Trouble and Double Trouble, he named them, and their antics filled the hollow spaces in his days with something he'd almost forgotten how to feel: delight. Sierra seemed to encourage these interactions, bringing the cubs closer to the cabin each day. When Bill spoke, She'd tilt her head in that attentive way that suggested she was cataloging his voice, his movements, his intentions. Sometimes he'd catch her watching him with an expression so human-like it took his breath away. She was studying him, he realized, determining whether he was worthy of the trust she was slowly extending. The breakthrough came during the second week, when Scholar approached the porch steps while Bill was reading aloud from one of his old picture books. The little wolf sat perfectly still as Bill's voice rose and fell with the story's rhythm, her golden eyes never leaving his face. When he finished, she yipped once and scampered back to her mother, who gave what Bill could only describe as an approving nod. Margaret would have loved this, Bill told Sierra that evening as the cubs settled down for sleep at the edge of the clearing. She always said animals understood more than we gave them credit for. I used to think she was being sentimental, but you're proving her right every day. As October deepened into November, their relationship evolved beyond simple coexistence. Sierra began displaying protective behaviors that both amazed and humbled Bill. When he stumbled on loose rocks during his evening walks, she would appear at his side steady and sure-footed, her presence offering support without crowding him. When his arthritis flared badly enough to keep him inside for 2 days, she stationed herself on the porch, refusing to leave despite her cub's restless energy. Most remarkably, Sierra seemed to sense his moments of confusion and disorientation. The episodes were becoming more frequent, times when Bill would find himself standing in a room with no memory of why he'd entered it, or when familiar names and faces would slip away like water through his fingers. During these frightening lapses, Sierra would appear, gently pressing against his leg until the fog lifted and he remembered where he was. "You're better than any doctor," he told her after one particularly bad episode. "Doctor, Peterson wants to run more tests, talk about cognitive decline and care facilities, but you understand what he doesn't. I'm not losing my mind. I'm just carrying too much sadness to think straight sometimes." Their peaceful routine was shattered on a gray November morning when Jake's silver sedan crunched up the gravel driveway. Bill watched from his kitchen window as his son emerged from the car, cell phone pressed to his ear, his expression tight with the controlled impatience that had become his default expression since his divorce. "Dad?" Jake called, climbing the porch steps. "We need to talk." Bill opened the door reluctantly, acutely aware that Sierra and the cubs had vanished at the first sound of the approaching vehicle. His son looked older than his 42 years, his hair thinning at the crown, his expensive suit wrinkled from the 3-hour drive from Albany. "Jake, this is unexpected." "Is it?" Jake pushed past him into the cabin, his eyes immediately cataloging the lived-in disorder. Unwashed dishes in the sink, newspapers stacked on every surface, the general air of a man barely maintaining the basics of daily life. "When's the last time you showered, Dad? Or went grocery shopping? Mrs. Henderson from the delivery service called me. She's worried about you." Bill bristled at the judgment in his son's voice. "I'm managing fine." "Are you?" Jake pulled out his phone, scrolling through what looked like a long list of notes. "You missed 2 doctor's appointments last month. You haven't answered my calls in 3 weeks. And apparently you've been telling people you're keeping wolves as pets." The accusation hung in the air between them like a challenge. Bill felt his chest tighten with the familiar mixture of love and frustration that Jake always triggered. His son meant well, but his definition of caring had always involved fixing, controlling, managing, approaching every problem like a real estate deal that could be closed with the right pressure and paperwork. "They're not pets," Bill said quietly. "They're friends." Jake's laugh was sharp and humorless. "Dad, listen to yourself. You're talking about wild animals like they're people. Doctor, Peterson told me about the memory issues, the confusion. This fantasy about befriending wolves is just another symptom." "It's not a fantasy." Bill's voice carried more steel than he'd felt in months. Sierra is real. Her cubs are real. They come here every morning because they choose to, not because I'm forcing them or feeding them or any of the other assumptions you're making. Sierra? Jake's expression shifted from exasperation to genuine concern. Dad, that was Mom's name for that wolf she tried to keep years ago, the one that got relocated. You're mixing up the past with the present. Before Bill could respond, a soft whine drew both men's attention to the window. Sierra stood at the edge of the clearing, her cubs behind her, watching the cabin with obvious tension. She'd returned despite the presence of the strange vehicle, drawn by some instinct Bill was only beginning to understand. Jake followed his father's gaze and went completely still. Jesus Christ, he breathed. There really is a wolf out there. 4 wolves, Bill corrected with quiet pride. A mother and her cubs. And before you say anything, they're not dangerous. Sierra has been protecting me, not threatening me. As if to prove his point, Sierra took several steps closer to the cabin, her attention focused on Jake's face. Her posture was alert but not aggressive, the stance of a guardian assessing a potential threat to something she'd claimed as hers to protect. This is insane, Jake muttered, but his voice lacked its earlier conviction. Dad, that animal could kill you. One bite, one swipe of those claws. She's had plenty of opportunities, Bill said. Instead, she's been keeping me company, giving me reasons to get up in the morning. For the first time since your mother died, I feel like I matter to someone again. The raw honesty in his father's voice seemed to catch Jake off guard. He stared out the window at Sierra, who had settled into a sitting position, clearly prepared to wait as long as necessary for this strange human to leave her territory. The real estate market is booming right now, Jake said finally, his voice gentler but still determined. This property is worth more than you could ever spend. You could move to that nice assisted living place in Albany, have people to talk to, proper medical care. People to manage me, you mean? Bill shook his head. Jake, I know you're worried. I know you think I'm losing my grip on reality. But what if I'm not? What if this is the most real thing that's happened to me since Margaret died? Then you're still living with wild animals that could turn on you at any moment, Jake replied, but his tone had lost its edge. And you're still forgetting appointments and isolating yourself from everyone who cares about you. Not everyone, Bill said, nodding toward the window where Sierra continued her patient vigil. She cares. In her own way, she understands what I need better than most humans do. Jake was quiet for a long moment, studying his father's face with the same careful attention he might give a contract he wasn't sure he should sign. Show me, he said finally. What? Show me these wolves aren't dangerous. If they're really as tame as you say, prove it. Bill felt a flutter of nervousness. Sierra had never been tested around strangers, especially not ones who radiated the kind of tense energy Jake carried like cologne. But something in his son's expression, a willingness to be convinced rather than just to argue, made him nod. Come on then, but slowly and keep your voice down. Cubs are easily spooked. They stepped onto the porch together, Jake staying slightly behind his father as if he might need to pull him to safety at any moment. Sierra's ears swiveled toward them, and she rose to her feet with fluid grace. For several seconds she studied Jake with those penetrating amber eyes, making some internal calculation that would determine whether he was friend or foe. Then, to Bill's amazement and Jake's obvious shock, Sierra approached the porch. She stopped just out of arm's reach and sat down, her gaze moving between father and son as if she were waiting for an introduction. Jesus, Jake whispered. She really is beautiful. At the sound of his quieter voice, Sierra's tail gave a small wag, not the exuberant greeting of a domestic dog, but the measured acknowledgement of a wild creature choosing to trust. Behind her, the cubs crept closer, their curiosity overcoming their caution. Sierra, Bill said softly, this is Jake. He's my son. though he thinks he's my keeper." Jake snorted, but there was affection in the sound. "And you think this wolf is your guardian angel?" As if she understood the conversation, Sierra moved closer to Bill, pressing her shoulder gently against his leg in a gesture so protective and deliberate that Jake's breath caught audibly. "My God," he murmured. "She really does care about you." The moment was shattered by the harsh crack of a rifle shot echoing through the forest, followed immediately by a yelp of pain from somewhere deeper in the woods. Sierra's head snapped toward the sound, every muscle in her body going rigid with alarm. The cubs bolted for the tree line, their playful confidence evaporating in an instant. "What the hell was that?" Jake demanded. But Sierra was already moving, racing toward the sound with the desperate urgency of a mother who knew her family was in danger. Without thinking, Bill grabbed his walking stick and started after her. "Someone's hunting on my property," he called over his shoulder. "And they just shot something." "Dad, wait," Jake called, but Bill was already disappearing into the forest, following the wolf who had become his reason for living into whatever danger awaited them both. Bill crashed through the underbrush with more determination than grace, his arthritic joints protesting every stumbling step as he followed Sierra's path deeper into the forest. Behind him, he could hear Jake cursing and struggling to keep up, his city shoes finding no purchase on the moss-covered rocks and fallen logs that Bill navigated by instinct and 40 years of familiarity. "Dad, slow down," Jake called, his voice tight with fear. "You're going to break your neck." But Bill couldn't slow down. Sierra had disappeared ahead of him, moving with the silent efficiency of a predator toward whatever had triggered that gunshot. The yelp of pain still echoed in his memory, high-pitched, desperate, definitely canine. One of her cubs, or perhaps another member of a larger pack he hadn't known existed on his property. The sound of voices drifted through the trees as Bill approached a small clearing he'd rarely visited, one that bordered the far edge of his land where it met state forest. He dropped to a crouch behind a fallen pine, motioning for Jake to do the same as his son finally caught up, breathing hard and sporting several fresh scratches on his face. Through the tangle of branches, they could see 3 men standing over something on the ground. One held a high-powered rifle with a scope, while the other 2 knelt beside what Bill's heart told him was Sierra's smallest cub, Scholar, the shy female who had been the first to approach his porch. Blood matted her gray fur, and her breathing was shallow and rapid. "That's one down," said the man with the rifle, a tall figure in military-style camouflage with the bearing of someone accustomed to command. "Tracker says there's at least 3 more cubs and an adult female in this area. We can get premium prices for the whole family if we take them alive." Bill's blood turned to ice. These weren't hunters. They were poachers, professionals who knew exactly what they were doing and why. Wolf parts commanded high prices on certain black markets, and live cubs could be sold to private collectors or illegal fighting operations. He'd read about such things in conservation magazines, but seeing it happen on his own land filled him with a rage that burned away every ache in his aging body. The second man, shorter and stockier with nervous energy, was setting up what looked like a large cage trap. "How do we know the mother won't just cut and run when she finds this one missing?" he asked. "Because she's been denning somewhere close by," the leader replied. "Garrett did his homework on this pack. They've been sighted around that old hermit's cabin for weeks. Mother wolves don't abandon wounded cubs. It's not in their nature. She'll come looking, and when she does, we'll be ready." Garrett. Bill's memory flashed to the local newspapers. Stories about a former Marine named Garrett Hayes who'd been struggling since returning from Afghanistan, lost his family farm to bankruptcy, wife had left with the kids, couldn't hold down steady work due to what people whispered was PTSD. Bill had even felt sorry for the man when he'd read about his troubles. Now, seeing what desperation had driven him to, that sympathy curdled into something much darker. "Jesus Christ," Jake whispered beside him, his voice barely audible. "Dad, we need to call the police." Bill nodded, reaching for his cell phone only to remember he'd left it on the kitchen counter in his haste to follow Sierra. The nearest neighbor was miles away, and by the time they could get help, Scholar would be dead and the rest of Sierra's family would be trapped or worse. As if summoned by his thoughts, Sierra materialized at the far edge of the clearing like a gray ghost made solid. Bill's heart clenched as he watched her assess the situation. Her wounded cub lying motionless on the ground, 3 armed men standing between her and her child, the scent of human predators thick in the air. Any sensible wild animal would retreat, call the loss acceptable, and focus on protecting the cubs that remained. Sierra was no longer operating on mere animal instinct. She let out a low, haunting howl that seemed to vibrate through the ground itself. It was answered immediately by calls from deeper in the forest, not just her 3 remaining cubs, but other adult voices. Bill realized with a mixture of awe and terror that Sierra had been part of a larger pack all along, one that had remained hidden until this moment of crisis demanded their presence. "Shit," muttered the nervous poacher. That sounded like more than one adult. Garrett Hayes hefted his rifle, scanning the tree line with professional efficiency. "Doesn't matter. We've got the firepower and they're just animals. Set up the speakers. We'll use the wounded cubs' distress calls to draw them in." But Sierra had no intention of walking into their trap. As the men fumbled with their equipment, she began moving around the perimeter of the clearing with deadly purpose. Bill watched in fascination as she employed tactics that seemed almost military in their precision, staying low, using available cover, positioning herself downwind to mask her scent. "She's hunting them," Jake breathed, his earlier skepticism about wild animals replaced by grudging respect. "She's actually hunting the hunters." The attack came without warning. Sierra burst from the underbrush behind the nervous poacher, her 110 pounds of muscle and fury driving him to the ground before he could react. His scream echoed through the forest as she clamped her jaws around his shoulder, not to kill but to disable, to remove him as a threat to her family. Garrett spun toward the sound, rifle raised, but he was facing the wrong direction when Sierra's mate emerged from the opposite side of the clearing. The black male was larger than Sierra, easily 130 pounds of prime predator, and his charge sent the stocky man sprawling into his own trap cage. "Dad, we have to help!" Jake started to rise, but Bill grabbed his arm. "Help who?" he asked grimly. "The people trying to murder Sierra's family, or the mother trying to protect her children?" The answer became academic as Garrett's rifle swung toward Sierra, who was still engaged with the first poacher. Bill saw the man's finger tighten on the trigger and knew that in another second the wolf who had brought meaning back to his life would be dead. 40 years of teaching had given Bill many skills, but combat wasn't among them. What he did have was the element of surprise and the absolute certainty that he couldn't watch Sierra die while he did nothing. He burst from cover with a wordless roar, his walking stick raised like a club, and threw himself at Garrett with all the fury of a man who'd found something worth fighting for. The impact sent both men tumbling to the ground, Garrett's rifle flying wide as they struggled in the pine needles and fallen leaves. Bill was 25 years older and 50 pounds lighter than his opponent, but desperation gave him strength he'd forgotten he possessed. He managed to land one solid blow with his walking stick before Garrett's military training took over. The younger man's fist caught Bill in the ribs, driving the breath from his lungs and sending stars exploding across his vision. A second blow to his temple sent him sprawling, consciousness threatening to slip away entirely. Through the growing darkness, he could hear Jake shouting his name, could see Sierra standing over Scholar's motionless form like a gray angel of vengeance. "You stupid old fool," Garrett snarled, retrieving his rifle and training it on Bill's chest. "You just got yourself killed protecting animals that would eat you if they got hungry enough." But as Garrett's finger found the trigger, Sierra made a choice that transcended every instinct for self-preservation in her wild heart. She abandoned her wounded cub and launched herself between the rifle and the old man who had saved her life, her body becoming a living shield as the weapon fired. The bullet meant for Bill's chest took Sierra in the shoulder, spinning her around and sending her crashing into the pine trunk behind her. She tried to rise, to continue protecting the human who had shown her kindness, but her legs wouldn't support her weight. Bill's scream of rage and grief echoed through the forest as he watched Sierra collapse, her blood mixing with scholars on the forest floor. In that moment, every loss he'd ever endured, Margaret's death, his growing isolation, his sense of becoming invisible and useless, crystallized into a fury that burned away fear and rational thought. "You son of a bitch!" he roared, struggling to his feet despite his injuries. "You killed her! You killed my family!" The raw anguish in his voice seemed to shake something loose in Garrett's hardened expression. For a moment, the former Marine looked less like a predator and more like a man who'd lost his way so completely that he no longer recognized his own reflection. That moment of hesitation was all Jake needed to tackle him from behind. The forest erupted into chaos as Jake and Garrett rolled across the ground fighting for control of the rifle. Bill crawled toward Sierra on hands and knees, his vision blurring from the blow to his head but driven by a desperation that overrode every ache in his battered body. Blood soaked through Sierra's gray fur from the shoulder wound, her breathing shallow and labored, but her amber eyes still tracked his movement with fierce intelligence. "Stay with me, girl," Bill whispered, pressing his hands against the wound to slow the bleeding. "Don't you dare leave me. Not after everything we've been through." Sierra's mate had pinned the nervous poacher against a tree, but the sound of gunfire had spooked him into retreat when sirens began wailing in the distance. Someone had heard the shots and called for help, though Bill knew it might be too late for the two wounded wolves bleeding out in front of him. Jake managed to wrestle the rifle away from Garrett, but the former Marine's combat training gave him advantages that Bill's real estate developer son couldn't match. A vicious elbow to Jake's solar plexus doubled him over and Garrett broke free, reaching for a hunting knife strapped to his belt. "This is all your fault, old man," Garrett snarled, his face twisted with a rage that seemed to encompass more than just this moment. "You and your bleeding heart bullshit. These animals are killers, and you're too stupid to see it." Bill looked up from Sierra's wounded form, his own blood trickling from the cut on his temple, and saw something in Garrett's eyes that he recognized from 40 years of teaching troubled children. It wasn't cruelty that drove this man, it was pain so deep and unprocessed that it had metastasized into something monstrous. "You're right," Bill said quietly, his voice steady despite the chaos around them. "I am stupid. Stupid enough to think that broken things can heal. Stupid enough to believe that love matters more than survival. Your wife probably told you the same thing before she left, didn't she?" Garrett's grip on the knife wavered. "Shut up. You don't know anything about my wife." "I know she married a good man who went to war and came back carrying wounds nobody could see," Bill continued, his teacher's instincts taking over even as Sierra's blood warmed his hands. "I know she tried to help, but you wouldn't let her, because admitting you needed help felt like admitting you were broken. And I know she finally gave up because she was drowning trying to save someone who kept pushing her away." The sirens were getting closer, but Garrett seemed oblivious to everything except Bill's words. "She said I wasn't the same man she married. Said I'd died over there and just forgot to lie down." "Maybe she was right," Bill said gently. "But that doesn't mean the man you are now can't be worth something. Sierra here, she was broken too when Margaret found her, scared, hurt, ready to bite anyone who tried to help. But Margaret didn't give up on her, and look what happened." Jake had recovered enough to stand, but he stayed back, sensing that something important was happening between his father and the man who'd nearly killed them both. In the distance, the wounded poacher was crying for help, but even he seemed to understand that this moment balanced on a knife's edge. "She trusted you," Garrett said, looking down at Sierra with something that might have been wonder. After you attacked her pack, after everything, she still tried to protect you. Because someone showed her kindness once, Bill replied. Someone taught her that not all humans are enemies. You can learn that lesson too if you're brave enough. Garrett's hand shook as he lowered the knife. It's too late for me. I've done things since I came back. Things that good men don't do. It's only too late if you stop trying, Bill said, his voice growing weaker as shock and blood loss took their toll. My wife thought it was too late for her, too. She gave up fighting because she couldn't see past the pain to the possibility of healing. Don't make her mistake. The sound of vehicles approaching through the forest grew louder. Police cars, ambulances, probably wildlife officials responding to reports of gunfire and wild animals. Garrett looked around like a man waking from a nightmare, seeing clearly for the first time what his desperation had driven him to do. Jesus Christ, he whispered, dropping the knife entirely. What have I become? The first responders burst into the clearing just as Scholar took her last breath, the small wolf's body going still despite Bill's whispered promises that help was coming. The sight of two wounded men, two dying wolves, and a former Marine standing over them with blood on his hands painted a picture that required no explanation. "Don't move!" shouted a state trooper, his weapon drawn. "Nobody moves until we sort this out." But Bill was already moving, crawling from Scholar's still form to Sierra's side as her breathing grew more labored. "Please," he begged the approaching paramedics. "She saved my life. She tried to protect me, and now she's dying because of it." Dr. Sarah Chen, the wildlife veterinarian who'd been called to the scene, knelt beside Sierra with professional efficiency. Gunshot wound to the shoulder, possible internal bleeding. She's lost a lot of blood, but if we can get her to my clinic. "Do whatever it takes," Bill said fiercely, gripping Sierra's uninjured paw as the veterinarian worked to stabilize her. "Money's no object." "She's family." Jake watched his father with a mixture of amazement and concern as paramedics checked his injuries. The man kneeling in the bloody pine needles, speaking gentle words to a dying wolf, bore little resemblance to the confused, isolated widower Jake had been trying to manage. This version of his father had purpose, had something worth fighting for, had found a reason to live that went beyond merely existing. "Sir, we need to get you to a hospital," one of the paramedics insisted, but Bill shook his head. "I'm not leaving her. If Sierra dies, then this whole thing was for nothing." Garrett Hayes, now in handcuffs but no longer struggling, spoke up from where the troopers held him. "The cubs," he said quietly. "There are 3 more cubs out there hiding somewhere. They'll starve without their mother." As if summoned by his words, a mournful howling rose from the forest. The remaining cubs calling for their wounded mother, their voices high and desperate with confusion and fear. Sierra's ears twitched at the sound, and she tried to lift her head despite the sedative Dr. Chen had administered. "Easy, girl," Bill murmured, stroking the uninjured side of her neck. "They're safe. They're calling because they know you're hurt, but they're safe." "Not for long," Dr. Chen said grimly as she prepared Sierra for transport. "Cubs that age can't survive on their own. If the mother doesn't make it—" "She'll make it," Bill said with fierce determination. "She has to make it. Those cubs need her, and she's too stubborn to give up. Trust me on that. I've gotten to know her pretty well." As they loaded Sierra into the veterinary transport vehicle, Bill caught sight of 3 small gray shapes at the edge of the clearing. Principal, Trouble, and Double Trouble watched from the safety of the underbrush as strangers carried their mother away, their golden eyes wide with the kind of terror that only comes from losing everything that matters. "I'll come back for you," Bill promised them, his voice carrying across the clearing. "I'll bring your mama home, and I'll come back for you. That's a promise." The cubs disappeared into the forest as the convoy of emergency vehicles began the careful journey back to civilization, carrying a wounded old man, a dying wolf, and the fragile hope that sometimes love really could conquer the darkness that threatened to swallow them all. Behind them, Garrett Hayes sat in the back of a police cruiser, staring at his hands and wondering if redemption was possible for a man who'd fallen so far from grace. And in the forest, 3 orphaned cubs huddled together in the growing darkness, waiting for a mother who might never come home. The fluorescent lights of Dr. Chen's veterinary clinic cast harsh shadows across Sierra's motionless form as she lay on the surgical table, her breathing so shallow it barely registered on the monitors. Bill sat in the adjacent recovery room, his own head wound, stitched, and bandaged, refusing to leave despite the doctor's concerns about his blood pressure and the obvious signs of exhaustion etched into his weathered face. Jake paced the small waiting area, his expensive suit torn and stained with blood and pine sap, his cell phone pressed to his ear as he spoke in hushed, urgent tones. "No, Mom's not coming," he said to someone on the other end. "She's been dead for 3 years, Tommy. Grandpa is just going through something right now." The mention of his grandson made Bill's heart clench with a different kind of pain. 8-year-old Tommy, Jake's autistic son, had been asking about his grandfather ever since the divorce. The boy had always been drawn to Bill's gentle patience, his willingness to repeat the same story dozens of times without irritation. But Jake had been keeping them apart, afraid that Bill's growing confusion would upset Tommy's carefully structured world. "How is she?" Dr. Chen emerged from the surgical suite, her scrubs stained with Sierra's blood, her expression carefully neutral in the way of medical professionals who'd learned to guard their emotions. "Touch and go," she replied, pulling off her surgical gloves. "The bullet missed the major arteries, but there's significant tissue damage and blood loss. Her body is shutting down from shock and trauma. Even if she physically recovers, there's no guarantee she'll ever be the same wolf she was before." Bill felt something cold settle in his stomach. "What do you mean?" "Wild animals can suffer psychological trauma just like humans," Dr. Chen explained gently. "The stress of captivity, the pain of surgery, the separation from her cubs, it can break their spirit in ways that never fully heal. She might survive only to become a hollow version of herself, unable to hunt, to parent, to live as a wolf should live." The words hit Bill like physical blows. He thought of Margaret in those final weeks, going through the motions of living while something essential inside her had already given up. The idea that he might save Sierra's life only to watch her fade away in the same manner was almost unbearable. "There's something else," Dr. Chen continued, her voice even more careful. "I found something during the surgery that changes everything we thought we knew about Sierra." She led them to her office and pulled up X-ray images on her computer screen. "See this?" She pointed to what looked like a small metallic object near Sierra's spine. "It's a microchip, the kind used to identify domestic animals. Someone implanted this when she was very young." Bill stared at the screen, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. "You're saying Sierra isn't completely wild?" "I'm saying Sierra was someone's pet, or at least someone's project before she became wild again. The chip is old, probably 8 or 9 years, and it's registered to—" Dr. Chen paused, checking her computer. "Margaret Thompson at this address." The silence in the room was deafening. Jake stopped pacing and stared at his father, whose face had gone pale beneath his bandages. "Dad, did you know about this?" "No," Bill whispered, his voice barely audible. "Margaret never. She said she'd taken Sierra to the rehabilitation center. She said they'd relocated her safely. She never mentioned keeping records, never said anything about a chip." But even as he spoke, memories were surfacing. Margaret's insistence on driving Sierra to the rehabilitation center alone, her tears that had lasted for weeks afterward, the way she'd flinched whenever he mentioned making the responsible decision. The way she'd started visiting that particular clearing more frequently in the months before her death, always alone, always with that distant look in her eyes. She never let her go, Bill realized, the truth hitting him like a physical blow. Margaret took her somewhere safe, somewhere Sierra could be wild but still connected to us. And I never knew. Jake sank into a chair, running his hands through his hair. Jesus, Dad. Mom was still taking care of that wolf all these years, even after you made her give it up? The implications cascaded through Bill's mind like dominoes falling. Margaret's secret trips to visit friends, her knowledge of Sierra's behavior and pack dynamics, the way she'd grown increasingly withdrawn after Bill had insisted on doing the right thing. Even her suicide. Had it been partly driven by guilt over the lie she'd been living, the secret she'd felt she couldn't share? She must have felt so alone, Bill said, his voice breaking. Carrying that secret, protecting Sierra without being able to tell me, and when Sierra started having cubs, when the pack grew larger and harder to manage, she probably felt like she was losing control of a situation she'd created, Dr. Chen said gently. The burden of keeping wild animals safe while hiding their existence from everyone, including her husband. That kind of stress, that isolation, could drive someone to break, Jake finished quietly. Could make someone feel like there was no way out. Bill closed his eyes, overwhelmed by the magnitude of his failure to see what had been right in front of him. Margaret hadn't just been caring for injured wildlife. She'd been maintaining a relationship with Sierra that had spanned years, a connection so deep that Sierra had viewed their property as home, had brought her cubs there because she trusted the woman who'd saved her life. And when Margaret died, Sierra had been left not just without her protector, but without anyone who understood their history together. No wonder she'd been so cautious around Bill initially. No wonder it had taken time for her to trust him. She'd been grieving too. Where is she now? Bill asked, needing to see Sierra, to somehow convey his newfound understanding. Dr. Chen led him back to the recovery room where Sierra lay unconscious, her chest rising and falling with mechanical regularity. Tubes and wires connected her to various machines, and her powerful body looked diminished, vulnerable in a way that made Bill's throat tighten with emotion. "Can she hear me?" he asked. "We don't know how much unconscious animals perceive," Dr. Chen replied. "But it can't hurt to try." Bill pulled a chair close to the table and gently placed his hand on Sierra's uninjured shoulder. Her fur was soft beneath his palm, warmer than he'd expected, and he could feel the steady rhythm of her heartbeat. "I'm sorry, girl," he whispered. "I'm sorry I didn't understand what you and Margaret had together. I'm sorry I was too scared and stubborn to see that love comes in all kinds of forms, and that sometimes the most important thing you can do is trust someone else's judgment about what matters." He thought about the cubs, alone in the forest, waiting for their mother to return, about Scholar's small body growing cold in the woods, about Garrett Hayes, whose own pain had twisted into something destructive because no one had known how to reach him in time. "Margaret knew you needed each other," Bill continued, his voice growing stronger. "She knew that broken things could heal if they were given enough love and patience. I was too afraid to believe her then, but I believe her now. So you fight, Sierra. You fight like she would have wanted you to, and I'll be here when you wake up. We'll figure out how to honor what she built, how to keep her promise to take care of you and your family." As if responding to his words, Sierra's ear twitched slightly, and her breathing seemed to deepen. It might have been coincidence, but Bill chose to believe it was recognition, acknowledgement, the beginning of a new understanding between them. Jake appeared in the doorway, his expression softer than Bill had seen it in years. "Dad." "There's someone here who wants to meet you." Behind Jake stood a small boy with dark hair and serious brown eyes, clutching a worn stuffed animal that might once have been a wolf. Tommy had his father's features, but Margaret's gentle expression, and he was staring at Sierra with the kind of fascination that only children could muster. "Is that the wolf lady?" Tommy asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "The one who saved Grandpa?" Bill felt his heart swell with an emotion he couldn't name. "Yes, son. This is Sierra. She's been taking care of me, and now it's my turn to take care of her." Tommy approached the table with careful steps, his autism making him naturally attuned to the quiet energy that surrounded injured creatures. "She looks sad," he observed. "She is sad," Bill agreed. "She misses her babies, and she's hurt, and she doesn't understand why all this happened to her. Like when Mommy and Daddy got divorced," Tommy said with the brutal honesty of childhood. "I was sad and hurt, and I didn't understand either." The parallel hit Bill like a revelation. Here was his grandson, carrying his own wounds from family dissolution, and maybe, just maybe, Sierra's story could help heal them both. "Would you like to help me take care of her?" Bill asked. "It's going to take a long time for her to get better, and she'll need friends who understand what it's like to be sad and scared." Tommy nodded solemnly, reaching out to gently touch Sierra's paw. "I'll help, Grandpa. Wolves are supposed to be in families, and families take care of each other." In that moment, Bill saw a path forward that honored Margaret's secret work while building something new, something that could heal multiple generations of wounds and create the kind of family that chose each other rather than being bound only by blood. But first, Sierra had to survive the night. Sierra's recovery began not with medical intervention but with the sound of a child's voice reading aloud in the pre-dawn darkness of Dr. Chen's clinic. Tommy had insisted on staying overnight, curled up in a chair beside Sierra's recovery table with one of Bill's old picture books, his gentle words creating a rhythm that seemed to anchor the unconscious wolf to the world of the living. "The little wolf was lost in the big forest," Tommy read, his finger tracing the words with careful precision. "But she wasn't alone because the trees whispered to her, and the wind carried messages from her family, and somewhere in the distance, someone was waiting for her to come home." Bill sat in the adjacent chair, watching his grandson with wonder. The boy who'd barely spoken since his parents' divorce was now pouring words into the silence with natural ease, as if Sierra's presence had unlocked something in him that professional therapy hadn't been able to reach. Jake dozed fitfully in the corner, his expensive shoes kicked off, his tie loosened, looking more relaxed than Bill had seen him in years. Dr. Chen entered quietly, checking Sierra's vital signs with professional efficiency. "Her temperature is stabilizing," she reported. "Heart rate is stronger. Whatever you're doing, keep doing it." "It's not me," Bill said softly. "It's him. Margaret always said children and animals spoke the same language. I guess she was right about that, too." As if responding to her name, Sierra's eyes fluttered open for the first time since surgery. Her gaze was unfocused at first, confused by the unfamiliar surroundings and the lingering effects of anesthesia. But when her amber eyes found Tommy's face, something shifted in her expression. Recognition, perhaps, or simply an instinctive understanding that this small human posed no threat. "Hello, Sierra," Tommy said quietly, not moving from his chair but meeting her gaze with the direct honesty that autism afforded him. "I'm Tommy. Grandpa says you're sad because your babies are lost. I know about being sad when your family breaks apart." Sierra's tail moved slightly, not quite a wag, but a sign of awareness that sent hope surging through everyone in the room. She tried to lift her head, wincing at the pain from her shoulder wound, but her attention remained fixed on the boy who was offering her something she desperately needed, understanding without judgment. "Easy, girl," Bill murmured, moving closer to stroke her uninjured side. "You're safe now. We're going to take care of you, and then we're going to help you find your cubs." The mention of her cubs brought a soft whine from Sierra's throat, a sound of such pure maternal anguish that it made Jake wipe his eyes and turn away. She struggled to rise, driven by instincts stronger than pain or weakness, but Dr. Chen gently restrained her. "She's not ready for that kind of movement yet," the veterinarian explained. "But her response is encouraging. She's fighting to get back to them, which means her spirit hasn't been broken." Over the following days, a routine developed that surprised everyone with its effectiveness. Tommy would arrive each morning with Jake, settling into his chair beside Sierra's table with whatever book he'd chosen for the day. He'd read aloud for hours, pausing occasionally to update Sierra on her cub's status based on the reports Bill received from the wildlife trackers who were monitoring the young wolves' movements. "Principal is being very brave," Tommy would tell her. "He's keeping trouble and double trouble together, just like you taught him. They're hungry, but they're learning to hunt mice and rabbits. They're waiting for you to come home and show them how to hunt the big animals." Sierra's progress accelerated beyond Dr. Chen's most optimistic projections. Within a week, she was standing for short periods. Within 2 weeks, she was walking carefully around the recovery room, her strength returning along with her determination to reunite with her surviving cubs. But it was the transformation in the humans that proved most remarkable. Tommy's selective mutism, which had plagued him since his parents' separation, virtually disappeared when he was with Sierra. The boy who'd struggled to communicate with therapists and teachers found endless words to share with the recovering wolf, telling her stories about his own experiences with family disruption and the hope that broken things could be fixed. Jake, meanwhile, discovered aspects of his father he'd never fully appreciated. Watching Bill's patient care for Sierra, his gentle competence in managing her rehabilitation, Jake began to understand that his father's apparent confusion and isolation might have been less about cognitive decline and more about profound grief. Bill had needed purpose as much as Sierra had needed healing. "I've been thinking," Jake said one evening as they sat in the clinic's waiting room while Sierra slept, "about the land, about your living situation. Maybe I was wrong to push so hard for changes." Bill looked up from the conservation magazine he'd been reading. "You were scared. I understand that. But I'm not the helpless old man you think I am, son. I just lost my way for a while after your mother died. Because you loved her so much you didn't know how to exist without her," Tommy said, with startling insight. He was sitting cross-legged on the floor, drawing pictures of wolves in a sketchbook. "Like Sierra loves her cubs. Love makes you want to protect things, even when protecting them is scary." The wisdom in his grandson's words hit Jake like a revelation. He'd been so focused on protecting his father from imagined dangers that he'd failed to see the real threat: isolation, purposelessness, the slow death of a man who'd defined himself through caring for others. "What if we tried something different?" Jake suggested. "What if Tommy and I spent more time at the cabin? Weekends, school breaks, maybe even summers when I can work remotely." Bill's face lit up with hope. "You'd do that, even knowing about Sierra and her pack?" "Especially knowing about Sierra," Jake replied. "Tommy's happier and more communicative when he's around her than I've seen him since the divorce. And honestly, Dad, you're more yourself too. More like the man I remember from when I was growing up." Their conversation was interrupted by Dr. Chen, who entered with news that would change everything. "I just got off the phone with the wildlife officials who've been monitoring Sierra's cubs," she said. "They're declining rapidly. Without their mother's milk and guidance, they're not thriving. We need to consider our options." The options were stark and heartbreaking. The cubs could be captured and placed in a wildlife rehabilitation facility where they might survive but would likely never be released back to the wild. They could be left alone in the forest, where they would almost certainly die within the next few weeks. Or they could attempt something unprecedented, reuniting them with their mother while she was still recovering in a controlled environment that could support both her healing and their development. It's never been done successfully, Dr. Chen warned. The stress of early reunion could set back Sierra's recovery significantly. And if she rejects the cubs due to her trauma, we could lose them all. Bill looked at Sierra, who was awake and listening with the intense attention she always showed when her cubs were discussed. Her amber eyes met his, and he saw in them the same desperate determination he'd felt during his own darkest moments after Margaret's death, the refusal to surrender what mattered most, regardless of the cost. "She won't reject them," he said with quiet certainty. "Whatever else happens, she won't reject her children. That's not who she is." The reunion took place on a crisp November morning in a large, fenced enclosure Dr. Chen had constructed behind her clinic. Sierra lay on a specially designed platform that allowed her to rest while still being accessible to her cubs, her shoulder wound still tender but no longer life-threatening. When the wildlife team released Principal, Trouble, and Double Trouble into the enclosure, the reunion was immediate and overwhelming. The cubs, thin and frightened but still strong, rushed to their mother with desperate whimpers and urgent nuzzling. Sierra responded with the fierce tenderness that only maternal love could provide, grooming each cub thoroughly while soft rumbles of contentment vibrated through her chest. Tommy watched through the fence with tears streaming down his face. "She's so happy," he whispered. "She's sad about Scholar, but she's happy the others are safe." Bill stood beside his grandson, his own eyes wet as he witnessed the power of love to overcome even the most traumatic circumstances. "Sometimes that's all we can do," he said softly. "Hold on to what we haven't lost and find ways to honor what we have." As winter deepened around the clinic, an extraordinary family took shape. One that included a recovering wolf and her 3 cubs, an elderly man rediscovering his purpose, a divorced father learning to balance protection with freedom, and an 8-year-old boy whose gentle wisdom bridged the gap between human and animal understanding. Margaret's secret legacy had evolved into something she could never have imagined, a sanctuary not just for wounded wildlife, but for wounded hearts of every species, where the broken could heal together, and love could triumph over even the deepest pain. The story that had begun with a desperate rescue in a forest clearing was becoming something larger, a testament to the belief that families come in all forms, that healing takes many shapes, and that sometimes the most profound love grows in the spaces between what we think we know and what we're brave enough to discover. Emotional message for American seniors, 200 words. If you're between 55 and 68, you understand what Bill Thompson felt. That crushing loneliness after losing someone who gave your life meaning, the fear that your best years are behind you, and the worry that you've become invisible to a world that values youth over wisdom. But Bill's story with Sierra proves something powerful. It's never too late to find new purpose, and love often comes from the most unexpected places. Like Bill, you might have written yourself off as too old, too set in your ways, or too broken by loss to matter again. But just as Sierra needed Bill as much as he needed her, there are beings in this world, whether human or animal, who need exactly what you have to offer. Patience, gentleness, hard-won wisdom, and a heart that understands what it means to survive loss and keep going. Your age isn't a limitation, it's your superpower. Your scars aren't weaknesses, they're proof you've lived and learned. And your capacity to love isn't diminished by grief, it's deepened by it. The question isn't whether you still matter, but whether you're brave enough to believe you do. Interaction questions. Have you ever had an unexpected friendship that changed your life when you needed it most? What keeps you going on the days when you feel invisible or forgotten? Please share your stories in the comments below. Your experience might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. The spring morning that marked 1 year since Sierra's rescue dawned clear and bright over the Adirondack Mountains, painting the newly constructed wolf sanctuary in golden light. Bill stood at the observation platform he and Jake had built together, watching Sierra teach her 3 yearling cubs advanced hunting techniques in the spacious enclosure below. Her shoulder bore a slight stiffness as a permanent reminder of that terrible day, but her spirit had not just healed, it had flourished. "Grandpa, look!" Tommy called from his favorite spot near the fence, where he'd been documenting the wolves' behavior in a detailed journal that had become the foundation for his homeschool biology curriculum. "Principal just caught a rabbit all by himself. Sierra's so proud. See how her tail is wagging?" Bill smiled, marveling at how much had changed in 12 months. Tommy, now 9, had become something of a local celebrity for his unique ability to communicate with the wolves and his passionate advocacy for wildlife conservation. The selective mutism that had defined his early years was now just a memory, replaced by an eloquence that amazed teachers and wildlife experts alike. Jake emerged from the newly built visitor center, a clipboard in hand and mud on his boots, evidence of his morning spent leading a tour group of families with autistic children. His real estate business had evolved into something far more meaningful: ecotourism that brought people to experience the healing power of human-animal connections. The man who'd once seen the land only in terms of dollar signs now spoke passionately about conservation and the therapeutic value of wilderness experiences. "The Hendersons want to bring their son back next month," Jake reported. "Apparently, this is the first time he's shown interest in anything since his father's deployment." Mrs. Henderson was crying when she saw how he responded to the cubs. The sanctuary had grown beyond anything Bill had initially imagined. What started as a simple desire to provide a safe space for Sierra's recovery had evolved into a nationally recognized center for wildlife rehabilitation and therapeutic programs. Dr. Chen had relocated her entire practice to the property, establishing a state-of-the-art veterinary facility that served as both a medical center and research station. But it was the human stories that truly defined the sanctuary's mission. Veterans like Garrett Hayes, who had served his sentence and was now working as a maintenance supervisor while attending therapy sessions, found peace in the daily routines of animal care. Elderly visitors discovered renewed purpose in volunteer opportunities that valued their wisdom and patience. Families dealing with autism, PTSD, depression, and grief found healing in the non-judgmental presence of creatures who understood trauma and survival. "Mail call," announced Dr. Chen, approaching with a thick envelope bearing the logo of the National Wildlife Foundation. "This looks official." Bill's hands trembled slightly as he opened the letter, not from anxiety but from the arthritis that reminded him daily of his age. At 70, he moved more slowly than he once had, but his mind was sharper than it had been since Margaret's death. Purpose, he discovered, was the best medicine for cognitive decline. "Dear Mr. Thompson," he read aloud, his voice growing stronger with each word. "The National Wildlife Foundation is pleased to inform you that the Sierra Thompson Memorial Wildlife Sanctuary has been selected to receive our annual Lifetime Achievement Award for outstanding contribution to conservation and community healing." The letter went on to detail the recognition program, which would bring national media attention and significant funding to expand their programs. But for Bill, the most important line was the one that honored Margaret's memory by naming the award after both Sierra and his late wife, acknowledging their partnership in creating something beautiful from tragedy. Margaret would be so proud, Jake said, his voice thick with emotion. She started all this, didn't she? With her secret kindness to one injured wolf pup. Tommy looked up from his journal, his expression serious in the way that always preceded his most profound observations. Great-Grandma Margaret is still taking care of things, isn't she? Through Sierra, through us, through all the people who come here and feel better. The boy's words captured something Bill had been struggling to articulate for months. Margaret's influence hadn't ended with her death. It had multiplied, spreading through every life touched by the sanctuary she'd unknowingly founded. Her belief that broken things could heal, that love was never wasted on the wounded and wild, had become a living philosophy that guided everything they did. A soft chuff from the enclosure drew their attention back to Sierra, who had approached the fence where Tommy sat. Over the past year, she'd developed an almost mystical ability to sense when the humans in her life needed comfort or encouragement. Now she pressed her nose against the chain link near Tommy's hand, offering the kind of wordless support that only animals seemed capable of providing. "I think she knows about the award," Tommy said solemnly. "Animals always know when good things happen to their families." The afternoon brought a steady stream of visitors, families on weekend trips, researchers documenting the sanctuary's innovative programs, and individuals who'd heard about the healing possibilities and wanted to experience them firsthand. Bill had learned to recognize the look that many of them carried, the hollow expression of people who'd lost their way and were searching for something to restore their faith in life's possibilities. One such visitor was Eleanor Martinez, a recently widowed teacher from Albany whose adult children had suggested the trip as a way to get her out of the house. She moved through the sanctuary with the careful steps of someone afraid to hope for too much, her eyes lingering on the informational displays that told Margaret's story and Sierra's journey from wounded rescue to protective mother. "Excuse me," she approached Bill hesitantly. "I hope you don't mind me asking, but how did you know? How did you know that caring for these wolves would help with the emptiness after losing someone?" Bill studied her face, recognizing the specific quality of grief that comes from losing a life partner. "I didn't know," he admitted. "I just knew that sitting alone in my cabin, talking to photographs and waiting to die, wasn't honoring what my wife and I had built together. Sierra gave me a reason to get up in the morning, but more than that, she taught me that love doesn't end when someone dies. It transforms into something else, something that can help heal other broken things." Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. "My husband used to say I had a gift with difficult students, kids that other teachers had given up on. Since he died, I haven't been able to imagine going back to teaching. I felt like that part of me died with him." "Maybe it did," Bill said gently. "But maybe something new is trying to be born in its place. Something that honors what you learned about caring for difficult cases, but applies it in ways you haven't considered yet." He gestured toward the enclosure where Sierra was patiently teaching her cubs to work together to solve a puzzle Dr. Chen had designed for their enrichment. "She lost a cub that day in the forest. Scholar died because of human cruelty and greed. Sierra could have become bitter, could have rejected all human contact and retreated into protective isolation. Instead, she chose to trust again, to love again, to believe that not all humans were enemies. And now she helps other wounded things heal," Eleanor observed, watching as Sierra gently corrected one of her cub's techniques. "Now she helps other wounded things heal," Bill confirmed, "including me, including my grandson, including my son, who thought he was protecting me by trying to manage my life." She taught us that family isn't just about blood, it's about choosing to show up for each other, especially when showing up is scary or difficult. As the day wound toward evening, the sanctuary settled into its peaceful routine. Visitors departed with contact information for future visits. Tommy completed his daily observations in his journal, and Jake reviewed the day's tour evaluations while planning improvements for the following season. Sierra and her cubs had retired to their den area, a specially designed space that mimicked natural wolf habitat, while providing the security and medical monitoring necessary for their unique situation. Through the observation windows, Bill could see Sierra grooming her cubs with the methodical care that spoke of deep maternal love, her amber eyes occasionally glancing toward the humans who shared her territory. "She's checking on us," Tommy observed, following his grandfather's gaze. "Making sure we're okay before she goes to sleep." "Just like Great-Grandma Margaret used to do," Jake added, settling into one of the comfortable chairs they'd arranged around the observation area. "Remember how she'd always do one last check of the house before bed, making sure everyone was safe and settled?" Bill nodded, feeling the truth of that observation settle into his bones. The circle of care that Margaret had started with one injured wolf pup had expanded to encompass multiple generations, multiple species, and countless individuals who found healing in the sanctuary's embrace. "Tomorrow we start building the new education center," Jake announced, consulting his project timeline, the one designed specifically for working with traumatized children and their families. "And next week, Dr. Chen starts the new research program on animal-assisted therapy for PTSD," Bill added. "The Veterans Administration is sending their first group of participants." Tommy looked up from his journal, where he'd been sketching Sierra's evening grooming routine. "And I start my new homeschool project on interspecies communication patterns. Mrs. Chen says my observations could help other kids understand how to talk to animals who've been hurt." As the stars emerged in the clear mountain sky, 3 generations of the Thompson family sat together in comfortable silence, watching over the wolves who had taught them that love was indeed stronger than loss, that healing was possible even after terrible trauma, and that family could include anyone brave enough to choose compassion over fear. Somewhere in the night, Sierra's gentle breathing mingled with the soft sounds of her cubs, creating a lullaby that spoke of safety, of belonging, of the profound peace that comes when broken things are made whole again. And in that moment, Bill knew with absolute certainty that Margaret's spirit lived on, not just in memory, but in action, in love made manifest, in the daily choice to believe that kindness could triumph over cruelty, and that every ending could become a new beginning. The man who had once felt invisible and useless now understood his true purpose: to be a guardian of healing, a keeper of hope, and a living testament to the truth that it's never too late to find your way home.